This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 204 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll be sharing the Real Talk strategy, a simple approach to getting your students to have richer, more natural, and more authentic classroom discussions. For a lot of teachers, the idea of classroom discussion often pales in comparison to the reality. What we want is for our students to lean in, to listen to each other, spontaneously offer thought-provoking questions, build on each other's ideas. We want them to go deep, to really get into it. And yet, many of us find that this is not an easy thing to manufacture, especially when it comes to discussions that have anything to do with the content of our coursework. On this podcast, I have offered a number of strategies that can help to facilitate better discussions. Try episodes 154, 109, 103, and especially 28 for lots of ideas. Today we'll be talking about another one, brought to us by ELA teacher Jessica Cannata, who shares lots of ideas like this one on the website EB Academics. The strategy is called, quite simply, Real Talk. She developed it after realizing that the more engineered discussion structures she had tried just weren't inspiring students to have natural conversations. Once she figured out the Real Talk approach, she got much better results. So today we'll be showing you how to do the same thing in your classroom. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Everfi for sponsoring this episode. Want to prepare your students for career and life success but short on time? Busy teachers use Everfi's standards-aligned, ready-made digital lessons to teach students to thrive in an ever-changing world. Interactive, game-based lessons designed by experienced educators help you engage students at all grade levels and bring critical, real-world skills like financial readiness, emotional literacy, STEM, and much more to your classroom. Thanks to Everfi's partners, all K-12 schools and students have access to Everfi's lessons free of charge. Join the 60,000 plus teachers who used Everfi's award-winning lessons last school year to serve over 5.5 million students. With spring semester officially in full swing, now is the perfect time to give your students a jump start on their future. Go to cultofpedagogy.com/Everfi, that's EVERFI, and sign up to get a virtual swag bag full of free goodies to get the semester off to a great start. Support also comes from Parlay. 3 years ago, I included a discussion tool called Parlay in my top EdTech tools for the year. Today, I'm excited to share with you that Parlay will be free for educators starting February 6th, 2023. They also recently redesigned the entire platform. For those of you who don't already know about Parlay, it's an EdTech platform that helps educators facilitate inclusive and student-driven discussions. Parlay's thoughtful suite of tools saves time planning and assessing written and verbal discussions. You also have access to thousands of discussion prompts created by teachers in the Parlay community who also strive to put student voice at the center of their instruction. To start running more discussions in your classes, head over to parlayideas.com and create your account today. Now let's listen to my conversation with Jessica Cannata about the Real Talk discussion strategy. So you came to me a little while ago with this idea of this just a discussion strategy that you used that really kind of broke a stalemate for you. So we're just going to talk about that today. But before we do, tell me so that my listeners have some idea of what you do in education.
Absolutely. So I was a classroom teacher for 10 years and then a literacy coach for 5 years after that. And when my third child was born, I left the classroom and I co-founded EB Academics with one of my best teaching friends, Caitlin Mitchell. And so we started this online community for middle school ELA teachers, and we've been doing that ever since, supporting them with fun lessons in the classroom so they get their time back on the weekends. So my role now is to come up with curriculum ideas, which is like a dream for me.
Yeah, it's I was just telling somebody this morning that I used to always feel like teaching was so perfect until you actually had to implement it with the kids and then everything fell apart. So if you're only doing the planning parts of it, it's just like this is so great.
It's so fun, and I always liked lesson planning, so now it's like,
Yeah,
that's what I get to do all
that's
day.
what
It's
you
great.
do. So you were Caitlin both were middle school English teachers.
So I was a 5th grade teacher at the school that
Got
we
it.
worked at together, but it was part of the middle school, and then she was the 7th and 8th grade teacher, and we were
Yeah.
right across the hall from each other, so we talked all the time, did a lot of our lessons
Oh my
together.
gosh. This is literally my exact background is
Really?
middle school ELA. Yes.
Right.
So and unfortunately, I feel like I have to, like, try sometimes because I try to reach all teachers of all
Mhm.
things, and so I worry sometimes that it's like, this stuff is all very relevant to middle school ELA teachers, but I hope
Sure.
it's also, and I think your strategy is absolutely something that can be used with really all ages
In all
and lots of
subjects.
subjects. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, let's start by talking about the problem that you had before you sort of landed on this.
Sure. So the problem was actually when I was a literacy coach and I was going into classrooms supporting the homeroom teachers. And there was one year in particular, it was actually my last year in the classroom, where the teacher had set up small group discussions. And then I was going to go around and facilitate, check in with them, make sure they were engaged. And it just was not working. And I mean, I think teachers can relate. It's dull. The students
Mm,
aren't engaged, and then they're talking very surface level things. And so I was so frustrated. I actually like dreaded that part of my day. I was with 4th graders at the time.
mm.
And I thought, okay, this is not working. They're not getting anything out of these discussions. It's almost a waste of class time. And I know it can be better than this. I know they can achieve more.
And you had them using these roles that we have seen quite a bit in, like, literature circles, book clubs a lot of times, and it's been advice that we've seen and probably have all given to teachers at some point in time is give students sort of these nicknames of what their job is. So
Right?
let's review what those are and what's
Let's
the problem with that.
do it. So first, I think we do it because it makes it sound more fun, right? We come up with
Yeah.
these roles for students, and you're going to be the vocab wizard, and you're going to be the literary luminary, and this is your task. And they get to go off and prepare for their small group or their literature circle
Mhm.
discussion for that chapter of the text. But the problem I saw with that is they'd show up and, the vocab wizard, great. They were prepared with 3 vocab words they didn't know. They said their piece and then they were done. They tuned out. And it was like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm off the spot. I don't have to pay attention anymore. And that was the same for all the roles. And that's why I felt it was so surface level. They
Mm.
just did that. And it was like, okay, I don't need to go beyond that task.
Yeah. It wasn't actually a discussion.
Not at
People were just
all.
reporting out their thing that they did, and then that was
Right.
it.
And I
Yeah.
would try to elevate it, right? I'd give them hints and questions. And if I was there with them,
Yeah.
yeah, then we could have a fruitful discussion. But if I walked away to another group, then it just backfired on me.
Right. So what did you do next? Like, what was the big epiphany that led you, which, by the way, you call this the real talk discussion strategy or approach. So,
Mhm.
which is it's an apt name for it because it is much less sort of structured and, formalized.
It is. And
But
I
how
actually,
did you
I
get
can,
to it?
sure, I cannot take credit for that name at all. And honestly, a colleague that I work with, Pat, she is the one who elevated this whole activity
Mm,
with her students. And she used it at a high school level, which I think is really interesting. So it worked with my 4th graders, and then it worked with her,
yeah.
AP language students.
Awesome.
So what I did with my students was instead of giving them those lit circle roles and
Hmm.
giving them the questions, we started using talking points. And that's also what Pat did with her students. And like I said, she took it to a whole new level, and I can get into that. But I would give my students talking points that they had to focus on so they weren't just focused on vocabulary or text to text connections or whatever it may be. Instead, it
Mm,
was 6 different talking points. So it might be vocabulary or a quote from the text or a word they found interesting or something the
mm,
author did, the style. And they would just write down their observations on it. And that's what made the discussion so much deeper because they were coming up with the talking points. It wasn't
mhm.
me just giving them questions and saying, okay, this is what you're discussing, go.
So, sort of like the homework assignment for the discussion was to show up with 6 talking
With
points, and
6
it's
talking points. Yeah,
fairly open-ended what they could do with that,
it
but it's so
is.
that's very organic. Like, what jumped out at you? What stood out or made you question or whatever. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, did you give them some, like, not mentor text, but examples of what these might look like so they had an idea?
100%. I think this is key. If you're going to try a real talk
Mm,
discussion strategy in your class, I think there has to be some practice. We have to scaffold that for our students.
mhm,
So before we even dove into a text,
mm,
it was a practice discussion activity. So in this case, we would give them the talking points and say, okay, go discuss. And it could be really fun things that they were going to be engaged with. So it might be
mhm,
something like, what's the worst piece of advice anyone could give? That's very open ended, and they might have some
right.
fun with that. Or I might pull a quote from the text and just give them that and say, why do you think the author chose this quote? Or what is
Mm,
interesting about it? So it was low pressure. They weren't getting graded on it, but they practiced as a group. And really, the purpose was, okay, this is how we come up with talking points. These are like Miss Kanata's talking points. This is what it looks like at an elevated level. And then this is how we share in a group, how we listen, how we build on each other's comments. So we would do that. I'd give them talking stems, all the things to set them up for success. And it was very, low stakes. We'd do that, we'd reflect on it, we'd talk about what we could do better, and then we could move into like an actual real talk strategy.
got it. So, okay. And the talking stems, let's talk a little bit about that too, because I think, I guess let me roll back for a second. How did you first introduce this to students? I mean, was it a conversation kind of like we just had about how these literary lit circle roles are kind of stiff, and we want you to talk, because I like you're writing a guest post for
Mhm.
this, and like one of the lines in there that you say is that, like, I want you to have conversations like, interested, curious adults just have naturally. Like, do you say that to your students also?
You know, I wouldn't use that exact language with fourth graders. And at the time,
Yeah.
like I said, I was using it with them, but I would say to them, okay, I've noticed that our discussions lately have been surface level. I definitely use that word with them. And I said,
Mm,
let's figure out a way we can have deeper discussions, because when you do go to middle school, that's what's going to be expected of you. And so we want to be ready for that. And so then they get excited, right? They're like, okay, she has high
yeah.
expectations. We can do this. So I always tried to make it fun and interesting for them and tell them, I believe in you. I think we can do this.
Yeah.
We're going to have to practice. It's not going to be perfect after one time, but let's give
Yeah.
it a try.
I feel like there's something about that age too, fourth grade, where they really are starting to think that they're growing up. They
Definitely.
start to take themselves very seriously because they're not adolescents yet. And so
Right.
they're just like, yeah, no, take me seriously. I have thoughts.
And they want to please their teacher still. So they're
Yes.
willing to
Yes.
do it. So I mean, it's kind of a good combination there.
Right.
But I
Uh,
know with, like I mentioned, Pat before, my colleague, I know with her students at an older level, they just naturally came up with these talking stems for
mm,
her. And she didn't have to say, hey, why don't you try a quote instead? She just observed them doing it. And I think as you get older, that is more natural. You're not going
mhm,
to say, let's discuss this question I came up with for the
right.
text. It's going to be like, hey, did anyone else notice so and so?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I remember you mentioned too is that, well, let's you because you talked about how sometimes once kids really get the hang of this, they'll just talk about one talking point for like the entire discussion because they just get into it, and that's okay.
And that's okay. Yes. I
Yeah.
think before, when we were doing lit circles, it was this pressure of, okay, every student has to speak, right? The vocab person has to go, the symbolism person has to go. So they cram it all in and
Right.
whew, we're done,
We're done.
right? And then you're like, oh, that was underwhelming.
Yeah.
But with the talking stems, it's perfectly okay if students only discuss one thing, as long as it's on topic, it's
Right.
focused.
Right. So, let's go through this. So you do the practice, which is really important. You practice with something where you provide the talking points for them.
Yes.
Okay.
And then
And
we're ready for, like I said, an actual text that we're studying in class.
right. Would it
So
make sense to do it with like a almost like a fishbowl where you just have like 4 or 5 students do the practice for everybody as an audience just to kind of see?
I think that could absolutely work. I
Okay.
haven't personally done it that way, but of
Yeah.
course that could work. And I like to do this with 3 students. I think 4 is probably the max, because you want to give every student a chance to participate, right? And
Okay. Mhm.
I think that's important. Um, so after that practice, and we've reflected and we go
Mhm.
into a text, it could be in social studies, it can be in science or math. And
Mm,
like I said, my
mhm.
background is ELA, so it would be probably with a chapter in a text
Yeah.
or a short story. Then what students do is they come up with their 6 talking points. So a question, vocab, style, quote, observation, connection.
Mm-hmm.
So they have 6 talking points. Then I instruct them to choose their 4 strongest ones. So they take those 4 strongest ones they're most interested in discussing and they put
Mm-hmm.
those on sticky notes.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get with their group mates and they start organizing their sticky notes. And I think this is actually very effective because it provides them with structure to the conversation. You know, when you have a lit circle discussion or you just let students go off and discuss, there's a lot of that, okay, who wants to go next?
Yeah.
Or just silence, like dead time.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
if we let students organize those sticky notes and come up with a strategy, like, do we want to go in chronological order for the story? Or do we want to organize all the vocabulary observations together? Or however they want to do it,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of gives them an outline for their discussion and then keeps them on track. So I think that's really important for them.
Yeah, and they've got I like the visualness of it too, that these are not just like thoughts that they have in their head. They've actually got, especially for people that feel awkward about having a conversation, you can just go to the post-it.
Yes.
It's
And I
yeah.
mean, that was me as a student, right? This would
Yeah.
have been uncomfortable and it would have taken me a while to get used to it. So I think relying on those sticky notes make it a little easier.
So they spend some time deciding what their approach is going to be, and then do you sort of give them a time limit on that, or is it just like once you've decided, go?
Go.
Yeah.
Go for it. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that's the natural part of it. I think of, book discussions I have now with my friends, and it's just like you start talking about it, right?
Right.
And I
Right.
think that's good for students. And we have to remind them, the first few times, like it's not going to be perfect. We might say, whoo, okay, we did not need 20 minutes. We were all done way faster. Or let's adjust this a little bit. And that's okay. Like we're building it together.
Right. And do they have the talk stems? Because I'm looking at that. We've got like a graphic that we're gonna like supply to
Yes,
people with some talk stems that you're suggesting. And it's like agree things like Leah's statement about X is true. Another example is, sort of building and then ways of agreeing and disagreeing, ways of exploring possibilities. Do the kids have those on their desks while they're having the conversation?
they do. So students come up with their talking points on their sticky notes, and then we
Hmm.
give them talking stems
Got it.
separately. So what I
Hmm.
did when I was in the classroom is I would print out my talking stems and honestly just tape it onto their desk. So it was always on their desk with them
Yeah.
because I wanted them always to be using these.
Right.
And I think at first it is a little awkward for students to say something like, Jen, I politely disagree with you. Let me
You're
offer
right.
my thinking. Like it sounds silly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's okay at first, but the more they do it, it starts to become more natural.
Right.
And I remember once my principal walking into the classroom and my students were having a discussion using their talking stems. And he was like, oh my God, like this is like a college level discussion they're
Yeah.
doing. And I said, yeah, but they've been doing it all year. So it's natural for them now. And
Yeah.
that's like a cool feeling for the
Oh, I
kids
love
to feel
that.
that.
Yeah. And I mean, I would also imagine that eventually you start to see and hear these phrases leaking out into just regular classroom conversations,
Yes.
right? Like,
It
yeah.
carries over into all your subjects. And I mean, it's a beautiful thing. It's the teacher
Yeah.
nerd in me, but I love when I hear them say, let me support that with evidence or, let me add on to
Right.
that. It's great.
Yeah. So, assessment of this. You've got a section in the article too about how to assess students. Talk about that.
Yes. So I think for any type of discussion, if it's a Socratic seminar or it's a real talk strategy discussion, I think it's really important to provide students with the rubric before we go off and have our discussion. They need to see, what are they being assessed on? Not for that
Hmm.
practice one that we described earlier, but for like the real deal.
Yeah.
And so what they are being assessed on is their level of understanding of the text, how well
Mm.
they analyze it, their active listening. Are they nodding in agreement or are they looking around the room and kind of bored?
Yeah.
And then are they using evidence from the text? So I just print out all my rubrics. I already have my students' names on them. So it's
Hmm.
just quick and easy. And I'm walking around and popping into discussions as they do it. And in addition to that, it's really helpful to collect their talking points so you can see
Mm.
what questions or what observations did they come up with. Because, of course, you're not going to hear everything, right, as you walk
Yeah.
around. So it's
Hmm.
nice to get an idea of, like, okay, what kind of questions were they coming up with or what were they discussing if I wasn't
Right.
there?
That was what I was going to ask is, how do you actually, because there's just no way to hear everybody's, do you ever do peer evaluations? I know that can get very sticky.
I have done that in the
Yeah.
past, and I think it honestly depends on the class. Like, I've just noticed some students, it was kind of like They weren't giving great feedback.
Yeah.
Whereas other groups, like they were ready for it and we would do it, not with every discussion though.
Right.
I would do it mostly more with Socratic seminars, but they would do it then.
So this is just a question that I like to ask lots of people because I think it's something we all struggle with. What do you do when a kid shows up and either hasn't done the reading or doesn't hasn't done the talking points?
Okay.
What
So
happens?
you
Yeah.
would, yeah, because it happens, right? That's
Yeah.
the
Oh yeah.
reality of teaching. You had mentioned earlier the talking points that can be done as homework. It absolutely can, or it can be done in class. So I
Okay.
think if that's the case, then just 10 minutes before the discussion starts, okay, everyone come up with your talking points right now.
Mm,
If you haven't read the text, I might pull you aside and you're going to have to do an alternative assignment for that particular discussion. But what I
okay.
found is that these are fun. These are
Right.
engaging conversations. So more often than not, students will put in the time for them. They want to
Right.
participate. They want
Yeah.
to come up with cool things to talk about and
Yeah.
have that, like I said, elevated experience where they feel like they're having an adult conversation in class. So they
Yeah.
typically do the assignment.
That's awesome. So you had mentioned your friend Pat and that she
Mhm.
had elevated this. So what did that look like? For this is
Yeah.
for
So
high school students, AP students, yeah.
right. So when I was doing it in fourth grade and fifth grade, more often than not, I was giving my students a few of the talking points just because what they were coming up with still a little surface level at first. So maybe by
Okay.
the end of the year, they could do two or three of them. But with Pat, with like I said, her AP students, they had to come up with all their talking points. And it was much more common for her students to be having those conversations where they focused on one or 2 points and went
Mm,
really deep with the discussion.
mhm.
Fourth, fifth, sixth graders, it tends to be more like, okay, we're working our way through the questions. They're used
Yeah.
to that. That's
Check,
more
check, check.
natural for
Yeah.
them. Yeah,
Mhm.
check, next one. And I think, again, that's okay. They're going to get better at this skill the more they do it. So with her students, they came up with all the talking points. They had a deeper conversation. And then afterwards, she liked to do a reflection with her students. And I just think this is such a cool idea to take all the groups, come back together as a whole class, and then have each group share, like, what was the talking point you spent the most time on? And I just
Mm,
think that's fascinating because it's going to be really
yeah.
different in each group. Why is that? Why do you think, one group talked about vocabulary the entire time and no one else even touched on that? And
Right.
like get their opinions on it. And I think that then enables future discussions to be a little
Yeah.
different. So I just
Yeah.
think that's such a cool like twist that she did with her students.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Do you that makes me wonder if you have an opinion on this. If you're repeating this activity over and over again, is it better to have kids stay with the same group or keep mixing them up over and over?
First, I think absolutely repeat this activity because the
Yes.
more you do it, the better they're going to get at it and try it in different subjects and nonfiction tests, fiction tests. So I just want to get that out there.
Yeah.
That being said, I like to switch up my groups. I think that's so important to hear different perspectives from different
Mhm.
kids. And there's always going to be those students who dominate the conversation and those students who are quiet. And I think as we start to observe our students doing discussions like this, we're going to notice those students and we're going to be able to say, okay, maybe, Jackson would work better with Jameson or whoever it might be and move them
Mhm.
around for next time so that students get, equal amounts of participation in.
Yeah. Well, I first of all, is there anything that we skipped over that we forgot to get into?
I don't think we skipped over anything, but I'm just, those of you listening, maybe if you're curious about trying this, I think it's well worth a shot because I think once you do it, you really do start to notice an increase in analysis, in collaboration, and
Mhm.
then truly in engagement with your students. It's just fun and it's a nice twist to a typical class discussion. So it's worth
Yeah.
a try.
Yeah. I love that there's no like when people hear about this, I think they're going to be like, "Oh, like it's so simple." But you know what I mean? There's no like gimmick to it or anything like that, which I think is
Mhm.
that's some of the best strategies are very similar to how we interact in the real world because it's
Yeah.
a smooth transition then into applying this in other areas of their lives.
Exactly, and it's one of
Yeah.
those things that it's like, "Okay, I can actually go do this tomorrow,"
Right.
right? There's
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
lot of prep involved. It's just
Right.
have your text ready and give it a try, and it's not going to be wonderful that first time. I mean, maybe it will be, but
That's
more
important
likely,
to note that though, because I
yeah,
think we tend to give things up way too easily as educators. Even if we have something that kind of works at like 80%, we're like, I'll take that over something that might not be great at first. Whereas if we
totally.
just stuck with it a little bit longer, it might end up being phenomenal.
Right. And I think
Yeah.
that's key here. It's like, okay, rinse and repeat over and over in different subject areas, and you're going to see results.
Yeah. And that's a key to efficiency in planning too. If you've got a certain strategy, I think that's your approach at EB Academics, right?
It's
It's like
100%.
a set of core strategies that you just keep reusing with different content.
Yes, because it saves you
Yeah.
time planning. So it's a win for the
Right.
teacher. And then your students master the standards because they're actually applying them over and over again. You're not just
Yeah.
like, check, done, move on.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing this. And where can people find you online? What's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, so we're on Instagram at EB Academics, and then you can check out our blog at ebacademics.com. We'd love to have you check it out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen.
For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, including downloadable images of the Talking Points guidelines, Talk Stems, and the rubric Jessica uses in her class discussions, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 204. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.